So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for coming to what's the second in our Harriman Institute sponsored series of lectures on human rights strategies and measuring human rights outcomes. One of the things that we're doing with the series is we're having experts talk about theories of change for how to promote human rights. What's the theory of change behind the strategy, and then empirically testing whether or not the strategy for promoting human rights actually works. So although the Harriman Institute is of course the institute that studies the post-communist world, Eurasia, and a lot of our interest in the project is thinking about strategies for promoting human rights in the post-communist world, strategies that have been tried and how did they turn out, but also what strategies might be effective in a post-communist environment is a good bit of our concern. But we're starting off the series by looking more generally and comparatively at strategies for promoting human rights that have been tried anywhere and everywhere in the world to evaluate what has worked and what ought to be on the menu as human rights promoters attack this agenda in the post-communist world now and in the future. So we are fortunate to have with us tonight Beth Simmons, who's a professor of government at Harvard University, who has written a fabulous book called Mobilizing for Human Rights, which has been described by Catherine Sickink, who was our speaker last week and inaugurated this series. Professor Sickink has described Beth Simmons' book as the most important new work by a social scientist on international law and human rights. And in this book, Beth Simmons addresses what I see as the mainstream approach of human rights organizations for promoting human rights in the world, namely starting with the formulation of human rights norms, especially embodied in international treaties, and using those norms to catalyze and mobilize actors in civil society to push for the implementation of those norms. And so Beth lays out the logic behind that strategy of promoting rights, and then she very rigorously and systematically tests to see whether that strategy works, but also, particularly interesting for us, is under what conditions, in what kinds of countries does this particular approach to promoting human rights get dramatic positive results, and also under what kinds of conditions does this strategy produce less impressive results. So we want to learn tonight both how and why this works, but also when does this not work? And from the post-Soviet standpoint, like what parts of our part of the globe are conducive for this strategy, and what parts of the post-communist world might actually require different strategies to be effective. So Beth Simmons, in addition to this fabulous new book, hot off the press, from Princeton University Press, is also the author of an award-winning 1995 book called Who Adjusts, which is on an international political economy topic, and it won the prize, the Woodrow Wilson Award, for essentially the best book in political science for that year. And she has her PhD from Harvard. We have two distinguished and lively and interesting discussants to comment on Professor Simmons' presentation. Tonight we have Ken Roth, who's since 1993 the executive director of Human Rights Watch, And before that, he was a federal prosecutor for the Iran-Contra case, and he's a graduate of Yale Law School. And after Ken Roth, we have our very own Alex Cooley, who's a professor in the political science department at Barnard College, who's been very busy writing, despite his tender years, a long list of books on the end of empire, state building, the politics of foreign bases and democratizing countries, and a widely cited article on the strategies of non-governmental organizations, the NGO scramble. And he's a Columbia PhD. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Beth Simmons, and please tell us about it.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak here at the Harriman Center. And I should disclose from the very outset that I'm not a scholar of the post-Soviet world. But I hope that some of the things that I have to say today at least spark some ideas, as Jack was suggesting, spark some ideas for how to think about whether and to what extent international law can, has, or has the potential to play a role in some of the parts of the world that you are most familiar with. So I'm going to outline a set of conditions under which I argue that international treaties have actually had some impact on the ground. Now, my question tonight, and some of you who come to the human rights area would rather have posed the question, what impacts human rights? What influences or improves human rights? I come at this question because I sort of came in through the door of international law onto this question. Instead, I'm looking at a narrower question. What influence has international law had on human rights? This book that I'm going to be discussing tonight was originally going to be a lot broader than what you're going to hear this evening. It was not going to just be about human rights. It was going to be about international law compliance generally. But for a couple of reasons, I decided to hone in on the human rights area, despite the fact that you could sort of get the impression that my background is quite a bit more in international political economy than it is in the area of human rights. And there were two reasons why I decided to hone in on the human rights area. And the first one is the problem that we don't have a lot of good international relations theory for thinking about why states might want to engage this area, why they might want to create treaties, why they might want to create a legalized regime, and what kinds of influences we could expect that to have. Weak theory. The second reason I decided to hone in on this area was, to be completely frank, was that when I tried to look for research assistants at the University of California at Berkeley, when I was starting to research this area, I would put ads out for undergraduates to join my research project. And I told them I'm going to do something on trade, a chapter on money, a chapter on territorial disputes and treaties, and a chapter on human rights. And out of 40 applications that I would get for these jobs, fully 30 of them wanted to pile onto the human rights area. And so I decided, you know, there's a real need for addressing this issue area. And that's why the book that I'm going to discuss tonight takes this focus on trying to understand how the international legal system has influenced human rights behavior. And the message is going to be, I think, appropriate to the theme of the series that is going to be unfolding here over the course of the next semester or so, is that international law has provoked some change in many countries. That ratified treaties in particular stimulate organization, participation, and mobilization when the following conditions hold. When people live in conditions where they can be convinced that the right will drastically change their well-being, and when they live under conditions in which they have some chance of making a demand that will succeed. And I'm going to really explain what I mean by this, but the shorthand terms I have in mind is when there is a motive and a means for demanding compliance with a ratified treaty, that treaties provide very useful strategic tools for trying to achieve your goals in the human rights area. Now, with a 450-page book, so I guess it raises the question, why did it take so many pages to try to establish this point? I think primarily that as it exists right now, there's not a lot of evidence on this issue area. There's not a lot of systematic look at the sort of a range of outcomes to see whether international law really has had much of an influence. Of course, it's an area everybody has an opinion on. That is, people presume or hold priors, if you will, about the influence of international law. But the evidence, I don't think, has been readily assembled in one place. So part of what I want to do this evening is to give you a sort of a little flavor of the kind of evidence that can be brought to bear in this issue, on this issue as well. I have two distinguished discussants tonight, and I can never predict what a discussant will say, but I'm going to suggest that there are sort of two kinds of responses generally. And I would imagine that Ken Roth will be closer to one, and that Alex will be closer to the other. And so one reaction that I've gotten in terms of sort of the more practical-oriented community is, Beth, you are leaning on an open door. Of course we use these treaties. It's obvious that we use these treaties to try to mobilize groups and to create and stimulate demand, sometimes litigating when that seems like a reasonable possibility. So my message to those folks is, we have a number of Alex Cooleys in the audience. That is, we have a number of scholars that come from the direction of international relations and have a harder time imagining that the cumulative effect of these treaties over time would really amount to anything very positive on the ground. And this is because all the shortcomings that we well know of, that these treaties are difficult to enforce internationally, that outside actors, states in particular, often have very little motive to become involved and entangled in the human rights issues of other states, and that in many cases they would just rather conduct state relations on a more diplomatic level rather than critiquing domestic political practices. So what I want to do tonight is to not offer you proof of my proposition, but instead just offer evidence of the proposition that these treaties have made a difference on the ground to a broad range of countries. And I'm going to specify some conditions under which these treaties have been especially important and especially useful. And the bottom line message is not that we should stop doing everything else, but that these treaties rightfully belong in a toolkit that the international community should use and should encourage locals to use as well when they are trying to articulate the kinds of demands that they would like to see their governments meet in the area of human rights. Let me start with just a little bit of background about the book. I mean, so one initial question is, why do we have an international legal regime for human rights at all? And I think this is an interesting question, and it's important, I feel like, to put it in a broader context over the course of the 20th century, where a lot of things are happening. A lot of things are happening that I think build sort of a context and a background in which these treaties might eventually gain some kind of traction. So, if we were to have had this lecture 60 years ago, the stunning fact is there would be almost nothing to say. That is, there'd be almost nothing, no treaties to point to. But a lot of changes have occurred over the course of the 20th century, and they have given rise, I think, to the possibility for the development of a meaningful regime. First, democratization. These treaties empower individuals vis-a-vis their governments. The natural constituency for such treaties would be democratic constituencies, would be countries in which there is a broad demand and broad responsiveness to the polity, to the individuals and groups in the polity. So the fact that there's been democratization over the course of the century has made it possible to create an international human rights regime that might be meaningful. The second development over time is that in international law quite generally, quite aside from the development of the human rights regime, there's been a growing tendency that treaties hold states parties more and more accountable over time. If you were to look in the area of arms control, if you were to look in the area of international trade, monetary relations, the incidence of reporting mechanisms, monitoring mechanisms, and surveillance mechanisms have increased throughout the international legal structure. Maybe it was prime time, sometime mid-century, to take into account this stronger demand for accountability in the international legal system. And of course, international civil society as well. The idea that increasingly the transactions costs for communication have decreased so significantly over the course of the 20th century that it's been very possible for those that represent or take part in international civil society to assemble and disseminate information that ends up breaking, I should say, the monopoly of states over information increasingly possible. Of course, one of the main things to keep in mind is that there were proximate conditions as well. These are well known. The Second World War, of course, gave rise to the development of an international legal regime precisely because of the atrocities of the Nazi regime. In addition, though, decolonization, I think, pushed the movement along for the development of an international legal regime. So countries that were newly independent, that were pressing for the recognition of people's rights or groups' rights vis-a-vis their colonizers, made good allies in this development of the international human rights regime in the 1940s and 1950s. Civil rights movements were important as well, so that a lot of the inspiration for what went on internationally in the creation of a universal declaration and an international covenant for civil and political rights reflected many national movements as well and drew mutual inspiration from domestic developments. So the alliance for codifying the principles that were eventually contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and putting them into a binding treaty form, I think came down to a combination of small democracies and newly independent nations who were interested, as well as non-governmental actors who were interested in creating legal strictures to control governments' behaviors vis-a-vis their own people. What you'll notice is missing from this coalition are the powerful countries. So the United States, of course, was interested in a non-binding universal declaration. The British weren't especially interested in legally binding treaties. Certainly, the Soviet Union was not, for reasons that are probably obvious as well. So it took this alliance, I think, to really get the creation of the international regime off the ground. The result over time was the development of a large number of treaties, which we can see taking off between 1945 and 1950 and then increasing. This is a picture here which sort of looks at the cumulative number of treaties in force, non-binding declarations in force relating to the human rights area, and other kinds of agreements and standards. But we can see increasingly, the bottom sort of set of the brightest, darkest part of the picture there relates to legally binding multilateral treaties that address the human rights area. So this raises some interesting questions about why states, once they're sort of faced with this decision of whether or not to ratify a treaty or not, would really want to put themselves on the line and publicly commit themselves to observing one of these legally binding international treaties. Now, when I started to examine this question, I decided to start looking at 6 of the core treaties, the core human rights treaties. Basically, these are the ones that I focus on when I try to look at the question of why do governments commit themselves? I mean, after all, wouldn't it be easier to stand aside, not get involved, and sort of not put your reputation on the line or make a promise that, in fact, you will live up to certain international standards with respect to human rights? So when I was looking at these 6 treaties, I was noticing some interesting patterns over time. Now, many people, not legal scholars generally, but many international relations scholars will argue that these treaties are ratified simply because they're costless. They're not enforced. There's no easy way to hold the state to its obligations. And so it's simply costless, and states take these sort of symbolic gestures to ratify these treaties. Well, if that was the case, we face some puzzles. If that's the case, it's hard to understand why you might get some of these patterns over time in ratification. What I'm showing you now are the 6 major treaties, and what I'm doing is stacking up the ratifications, basically, of those treaties over time. On the vertical axis, we're just getting a total number of ratifications for these 6 treaties if we were to add them all up. And there's some interesting things going on here. If treaties were costless, why doesn't everybody jump on board? And why don't they do it immediately, or the same for all treaties? And that's not what's going on here. Instead, what's going on is we can see some treaties glean a lot of international ratifications very quickly. The one that especially does so is the Children's Convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's the dark purple one that's near the top. Look one space above that, though, and you'll see the Torture Convention. And the Torture Convention is the orange one over there. You can see on the very top, it's slow getting off the ground, and it never does get the broad adherence through ratification that the Convention on the Rights of the Child gets. And we can think of a lot of reasons why that might be the case. Torture is often related to issues having to do with national security issues, for example, or sometimes just the government's perceived security, its own security, torturing opponents, that type of thing. Children, on the other hand, are seen as harmless beings, and for the most part, don't pose much of a big risk for ratification. In addition, there's another difference between these 2 treaties as well. The torture treaty is non-derogable. It does not admit of exception. Despite some creative interpretations that we've heard over the last 8 to 10 years or so, it is not the case that there are any circumstances under which the Torture Convention permits a country to torture. It's non-derogable. On the other hand, the Children's Convention is often described as an aspirational treaty. It does admit that there are some circumstances under which it would be difficult for a state to meet its full obligations, and it fully recognizes those conditions. So there are some differences across these treaties that we should not be able to see if it were simply the fact that ratifying these treaties was completely costless across the board. This pattern is also difficult to understand if ratifying treaties are costless. Some regions don't engage in ratification of these treaties on nearly the same scale as other regions do. So this is just the average number of these 6 treaties ratified regionally. And we can see clearly that Asia and the Pacific region is a lagging region for some reason. This doesn't tell us why, of course. We can see that Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, the area of the world that this institution is particularly interested in, is one of the big ratifiers of these treaties. But that does raise the question as to if it's costless, why aren't, why isn't the countries in the Asian region doing it as well? If they had the same preferences and faced the same costs, we should see the same thing across these regions. And we patently don't see that. Well, one of the things that I try to spell out in this book is how do we sort of sort out our expectations about ratification of these treaties? And I imagine that we could divide the world into a set of expectations. There are countries out there which we would expect to comply, for the most part, with a treaty because they already have fairly good rights practices when they're faced with the treaty. And these are countries that I would expect to comply, and in fact, they do. And they pose very few puzzles for us. They're exactly what you would expect. And I call those countries the sincere ratifiers. They support the treaty from the outset. They have a preference match with the treaties. A lot of times, the package of treaties that are already in force or close to being in force in their polities match very closely what's required of the treaties. They don't need to adjust much. They anticipate they'll have to change relatively little. On the other hand, and that's the upper left-hand corner, but now look at the lower right-hand corner. There are also a set of countries that we would not expect to comply, and they don't. And again, we're not very puzzled here. These are countries that are sincere non-ratifiers. They oppose the contents of the treaty. Their preferences are quite a bit different. They anticipate that they would have to adjust maximally in some cases were they to ratify, and they don't. They stand out. They stand away from the treaty and stay outside of the regime. China, with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, is a good example of, I think, a sincere non-ratifier, even though I know that they are in the process of thinking about what would it take for China to ratify the convention, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. The real puzzling thing are the cross diagonals here. That's what creates an interesting puzzle and raises questions. On the one hand, there are a number of countries out there that you would expect to comply, yet they don't ratify. And how can we explain this? I call them false negatives. And these countries, I argue, often have domestic political institutions in place that raise the cost of ratifying. And I specify these and test these empirically in the book. They tend to have high ratification hurdles. Countries that require a supermajority rather than a bare majority, for example, to ratify a treaty. They tend to be federalist countries. So countries that involve a lot of subnational units which often have some kind of authority or competence over the areas that the treaty tries to regulate. And I also make an argument about the nature of the legal system. I argue that in common law countries, introducing a treaty as a broad principle from which we can deduce the right answers is foreign to the way of sort of legal reasoning in those countries, which is very inductive, very bottom-up. As well in common law countries, a government has to be concerned about the way that the treaty will be interpreted in very powerful courts with a lot of authority to broadly interpret the meaning of a legal obligation. And so in those kinds of legal systems, compared to civil law systems, there's a tendency to hang back and to not readily ratify these treaties until it's very clear what the treaty requires. They also tend to put a lot of reservations in place, I seem to find. We also have now, and by the way, one of the countries that I would call a false negative in many ways is the United States. We fit a lot of those criteria. And so it's puzzling to many people why we haven't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's puzzling to many countries why we haven't ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, when it seems like children and women are reasonably well endowed with rights and protections in this country that seem quite broad and stronger in many ways than the treaties themselves. So now what we have down here in the lower left-hand corner is the box that really troubles folks who have studied the international legal system and the system of treaties. The case in which we have countries that we don't expect to comply, they don't be appearing to make any kinds of efforts to actually comply with treaty obligations, yet they ratify. These are the very irritating cases. They are the cases that appear to degrade the nature of the obligation itself and to really cast doubt on the effectiveness of the international treaty system. These cases I label to be false positives. These countries, I argue, are engaging in strategic behavior. Okay? So these countries are trying, I argue in the book, to avoid the cost of international criticism. But I'm very careful to note that this is a strategy that only works in the short run. Okay? So this is a case of trying to achieve social camouflage, trying to do what the other countries that you normally compare yourself with are doing. And one of the interesting empirical findings that I found in the book is that there is a very strong tendency to ratify treaties if the other countries in your region have done so. And I argue that this is because they're rationally trying to avoid being singled out as the one laggard to sort of stay outside the system. Because if you think about it, non-governmental organizations and other bodies who might want to criticize those who stay outside of the treaty regime have a limited budget. They can't go after everybody. They can only go after laggards. And if, broadly, nobody in the region is ratifying, it's hard to sort of pick out one country and criticize them. It's hard to pick out one country and criticize them. And so what we find for the most convincing explanation for false positives is sort of a dynamic like this, a schooling effect. Now this is perfectly rational here, although I don't make any assumptions about the brain power of fish. But we know what's going on in this picture. We know that they are schooling because if they were to sort of swim separately, they would be subject to attack by a shark. And the analogy in the international setting is that states who don't school like this are subject to attack by Amnesty International or other non-governmental organizations. And so it's a rational thing to do, to school, to pool, to hide, to camouflage oneself among the group that you normally compare yourselves to. And I found this was actually a very clear empirical regularity when I was looking at ratification. And this could help to explain why we get false positives. Some countries that ratify but have no intention to really change according to the treaty. So why don't these strategic ratifiers who are just trying to camouflage themselves anticipate ratification pressures? Well, one reason is they often have information deficits. So I found when I was looking at this work that a lot of mimicry went on in regions that had poor information. And I looked at the degree of freedom of the press, for example, in the different regions, and found mimicry really high where the press was controlled by governments. Mimicry was low in regions where the press was rather more free. So information deficits are one possibility. Similarly, I found a lot of mimicry in the 1980s, before there was a denser network of non-governmental organizations that could criticize. And it wore away in the 1990s. Mimicry was a lot less later on, where the information environment was a lot denser. Time horizons are another issue. I also found that when you look just at autocratic governments, that they tended to ratify treaties towards the end of their term in office, the end of the period that they were in office. Sometimes perhaps wanting to leave a legacy that they had been sort of liberalizers at the end, but never wanting to live with the consequences of actually empowering their political opposition. Miscalculation is another example. So when Pinochet ratified the Convention Against Torture, he probably was not anticipating, probably not calculating, that that would be the very treaty which might have something to do with his extradition, only about a decade later. So basically, I argue that some governments calculate based on imperfect information and with short time horizons, that ratification might be worth the gamble for some very short-term benefits, maybe praise, maybe inclusion, positive publicity, etc. Okay? So that's the argument I make about why states commit themselves. The question that we're all very interested in, though, is what difference does any of this make? And so in order to answer that question, I look very closely at domestic politics. And the argument that I make is the main argument I make in the book. This isn't the only argument, but I'm just going to simplify and focus in on one of the mechanisms that I look at in the book, is that ratified treaties help to mobilize groups to expect and to demand their rights. And I argue that treaties have two kinds of effects in countries. They influence values. They can have an educative function. That is, they can actually convince people who had never thought so before, that they could imagine themselves as rights holders. And in addition, they actually increase the chances of successfully demanding your right. They turn out to be a legal resource, and they are often can be used in conjunction, for example, with litigation and other strategies to try to increase the size of the coalition that begins to demand rights change. Now, in order to flesh this out, let's think first of all why people would mobilize at all in the first place, never mind a treaty. And the way I think about this is that people mobilize when the expected value of mobilizing is high. And expected value really is a function of two things. It's a function of how likely you are to succeed and how much value you put on succeeding. And if you think of those two things interacting, when that's maximized, that's when you're likely to get excited to mobilize. The argument that I make in the book is that in stable autocracies, when you mobilize, you're likely to succeed is low. Although, on the other hand, in a stable democracy, when you mobilize to demand something, anything, you have a relatively much higher likelihood of succeeding, which is the nature of responsive government, almost by definition. What about, though, your value of success? Well, in a stable democracy, in a democracy that broadly guarantees a broad number of rights, and in addition has a lot of citizen participation already, the value that you might place on one additional right on the margin is likely to be small. But the introduction of a right, a new right in a stable autocracy, is potentially radical. It really can introduce completely new conceptions of what you might be able to demand. And this suggests that mobilization, if you sort of think of the maximization of the value you place on what you demand, getting it, and the likelihood that you'll succeed, these things are maximized in the middle of this kind of distribution here across regime type. By the way, depending on the rights issue area, we don't have to be thinking about autocracies and democracies. We could be thinking on other dimensions. The general dimension across the bottom is this sort of hostility towards making the demand. And when I look at the women's rights, for example, I look very carefully at the strength of the coalition between organized religion and the state. For the case of women's rights, often that is what we should be looking at along this bottom scale here, and not necessarily autocracy versus democracy. So the expected value of mobilizing ought to be somewhere in the middle. Now, what happens when you introduce a treaty? Okay, so let's just go back to the original picture and think about the introduction of a treaty now in this setting. And I argue that treaties have their most radical effect on the likelihood of succeeding in stable democracies. They are a new resource, they're a legal resource. They can sometimes be used in litigation. They can grow the size of the coalition. They can help to create a focal point so that it's clear what we're demanding. And when I talk about growing the size of the coalition, I'm talking about a treaty increasing the group of those interested in compliance, from just those who might benefit from compliance with the treaties to those who might additionally have other reasons for wanting to comply. So it grows from a pro-rights coalition to a pro-compliance coalition. And oftentimes what we see is that when a treaty is ratified, new groups get on board that aren't necessarily closely identified with the right per se. Foreign ministries, the legal profession, others that have an interest in compliance with the treaty who might not have a real clear sort of dedication to the right itself. So in a stable democracy, it increases your likelihood of succeeding. In a stable autocracy, a treaty, I'm sorry to say, does not increase your likelihood of succeeding very much. But it does alter the value that you might place on success by introducing a new and radical idea. I didn't know I could consider myself a property owner, a minority might say. Or I didn't know, a woman might say, that I could inherit the apartment of my husband, and I thought that it was going to have to go to my son, who, by the way, kicked me out of my apartment. So to imagine yourself now as a rights holder in a new way is likely to be radical in a stable autocracy or in another kind of regime that is hostile to the right in question. So what we see then is sort of this asymmetrical shifting of these curves representing the likelihood of success and the value of succeeding, the value placed on succeeding. In a stable autocracy, the value placed on success goes up. In stable democracies, the likelihood of succeeding goes up. Let me just give you sort of a sense of what this could mean in a stable democracy, for example, the likelihood of succeeding. I argue that one sort of possibility for democracies is that they can use the courts, that they can use a treaty to stimulate an inquiry and place questions before a panel of judges in the legal system. This is just an example of this happening in Israel, for example, a country I would consider a stable democracy, but one which has obvious challenges with respect to its standards relating to torture. Okay, so this is a case in which after ratification, and also, I should admit, after changing the basic law that comes into closer compliance with the Convention Against Torture, there was a large bulge in the number of cases that went to the Israeli Supreme Court. Eventually, in 1999, the Israeli Supreme Court made a landmark decision. And this decision did not make torture illegal. But it did say that if you are going to torture, you're going to need to change the law to do that. Well, this means that in the Israeli Knesset, there would have to be a law on the books now debated and defended that torture is a good thing, or that torture is in our interest. And that created an entire new dynamic in Israel. We can't be the only country in the world that has legalized torture by international standards. And so they backed away from that position, never did pass a law to that effect. And if you look at some of the ratings by, some of the codings that have been done by political scientists based on State Department reports as well as Amnesty International reports, their torture practices were at least partially ameliorated after this court decision. Torture is tricky, of course, because you can find ways to do it that don't leave the same kinds of marks and scars and overt kinds of evidence. But nonetheless, there did just seem to be some amelioration in the practices in Israel after this court decision. Another case you could look at is the use of the courts in Chile, for example. Two things are going on in this is again relating to torture. Two things are going on, though, right in 1997, 1998 in Chile. One is the Pinochet example of how powerful the torture treaty actually is, and the use of that treaty to demonstrate that there is a possibility for using this treaty as a legal instrument. At the same time, those of you who know the process of democratization in Chile, there was an important court reform going on in Chile in 1997, 1998 as well. It was a period in which the cronies from the Pinochet regime were to a great extent cleared out, and the courts became credible places to actually put these torture cases before a panel of judges. So these are conditional arguments. This isn't available everywhere. Courts are not a realistic option everywhere. They're a realistic option, though, where you have a fairly independent court system. And by 1997, 1998, Chile did have that. All right, so what this is basically, I think, arguing, when you think of both of those curves go up, is that the motive and the means to mobilize and the influence that a treaty actually adds, when those two branches or those two curves kind of move up asymmetrically, is that introducing a treaty has a stronger impact on mobilization. Not in the stable autocracies, where you will be crushed, and not in the stable democracies, where you already enjoy 99 rights, and now we're talking about 100, but instead in the countries in between that are transitioning, maybe volatile, maybe not very democratic, in which introducing a treaty really stimulates groups that now think they can increasingly succeed and believe that there's value to trying to do so. And this just simply shows us, this is a result of a regression that shows that the correlation between ratifying a treaty and the mobilization of groups gets stronger and more positive after ratification. Okay? And this is controlling for a lot of other things. So basically, this puts now the number of women's international non-governmental organizations on the left-hand side of a multiple regression, and puts ratification of the treaty and a lot of other variables on the right-hand side, to give you a sense that it's plausible that groups mobilize once there's been a ratification. This is a period where you can actually influence implementation, and they get excited to participate and to do so. All right, so my expectation, though, is that treaties should have their greatest and most positive impact in the more fluid, transitional, and partially democratic regimes. Now, let me show you some evidence related to the torture regime. The book contains chapters on civil and political rights, women's rights, and children's rights. But the only thing that we have the least bit of time for left, in the few minutes remaining, is the area of torture. And so I just want to give you a little bit of evidence on this. So this is the scale that I use to try to examine the incidence of torture and the intensity, really, of torture. I don't believe it makes any sense to count tortures. I don't believe that. But it does make sense to put states into broad categories. And we can make these categories based on two kinds of databases that now have a good long history. One are the country reports of Amnesty International, and the other are the reports that are put together by the State Department. And they use language like this, that you can see up here, that can help us to categorize states from those that are the absolute worst, where torture is prevalent, widespread, repeated, and methodical, where folks are abused to death commonly, frequently, and it's a widespread practice. That's category number 1. To category number 5, where we can see some instances of psychological mistreatment, and they're isolated, for example, and there's usually a punishment or some kind of follow-up, a disciplinary follow-up involved. And we can think of categories in between according to the scale. Now, if you were to graph this scale and you were to graph the proportion of states that have ratified the Convention Against Torture, you would get something like this, with the torture scale on the left-hand side and the countries who have ratified the CAT on the right-hand side. Okay, and you can see a little drifting down over time in this scale, which we might want to discuss, by the way. It could reflect changing norms. It could reflect that what we used to consider torture in the 1980s, now we would include many other things in torture as well. So it could be normatively some drift downward. It could be better information. The more we know, the more we find out. Okay, because torture, after all, is something governments try to hide, quite obviously. Okay, so when I looked at this evidence, and when I did a multiple regression again, controlling for a lot of other things, because after all, signing a treaty is hardly going to be the only influence on torture practices. Nobody would think so. So instead, it's important to design a test in which you've carefully controlled for other obvious explanations. In addition, a test where you've controlled for the things or the conditions that explain ratification of the treaty in the first place and net those away. So we're no longer just saying, oh, whatever made you ratify the treaty explains that you were on your way to not torturing anyway. Once we've developed a model which takes care of those obvious objections, we can look at the relationship between the ratification of the Convention Against Torture and its effects. Positive is an improvement here on the scale, and the P equals something, relates to the probability that the estimate we're getting on the effect is any different than 0. Okay? So what we have on countries that have never been democratic, no effect. This could just be 0, with a little bit of noise around 0. No effect to ratifying the treaty. Stable democracies, a little bit of a positive effect, but we can't distinguish it from 0. Too much noise, too much variation. We find something different, though, in the transitional countries here. We find that there is probably about a 94% chance that this positive improvement in the torture scale is not due to chance alone, that there's a systematic relationship between ratifying the treaty and the improvement on the torture scale. Now, what I'm just showing you is a correlation. That's all that I'm showing you here. But once you've taken out all these other possible explanations, and once you've tried to develop a model that explains ratification of the treaty in the first place, then I think you're left with, a stronger inference that there might be something causal behind this correlation. Let me draw a few conclusions and then invite your questions and your comments, and those of the commentators as well, very quickly. Human rights treaties, I think, may have really contributed strongly in some cases to an improvement of rights around the world. We can't say conclusively that they have, and moreover, we don't know the net effects. Are there any negative pushback effects that I haven't been able to model very successfully? The effects differ across countries. There is no one homogeneous effect across all countries, but it's really concentrated in these transitional countries. The effects of ratification also differ quite a bit depending on the right that you're talking about. I only had time to show you torture. The effects differ across some of these other issue areas. And then finally, the policy implication is that at least in countries that have had some experience or have some possibility of an experience with responsive government, that it makes sense to encourage the ratification of these treaties. Not only that, it would make good sense if countries like the United States would use their rhetoric and their material resources to show that they support these treaties as well. Because it seems like the least you can do to sort of give those on the ground some possibility of trying to achieve their own interests when it comes to their rights realizations. So I'd like now to, I guess, turn it over to the commentators and invite your comments and responses.
Thanks, Beth. You really managed to capture the essence of the 400-page book. Good job. So our first discussant is Ken Roth.
You need this?
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to flip it off.
Okay. Well, Beth, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and an interesting book. I'm not going to say what you, I think, predicted I would say, which, I mean, at a certain level, naturally, I think treaties matter. Ratification of treaties matter. So I don't find that a controversial proposition, and I'm happy that you were able to prove that. But I'm going to. I mean, I also understand sort of the political context in which you thought it was important to pursue that, because I realize that there are some who claim not only do treaties sort of not matter, but that ratification is negative. And, taking I guess the case where that would come out most acutely would be your false positives. And I agree with you that that's a short-term strategy. That perhaps for a moment ratification could deflect pressure. But it's not a long-term strategy, because, over time, the human rights movement will get to that country, and the ratification won't help. I actually think it's interesting the point you made about autocrats doing this toward the end. I would interpret that differently. I mean, whereas, an elected government knows when the end is, almost the definition of an autocrat is that they don't know when the end is. They're trying to cling to power. And so, if indeed ratifications of autocrats tend to come toward the end of what in retrospect we know was the conclusion of their regime, it may have been sort of a last-ditch effort to cling to power. And that, as the pressure is building for them to step down, they may have sort of offered this as, one last effort to legitimize their rule, which failed, since we know it was at the end. But anyway, that's a small point. My main thesis here is I think different from what you would expect me to say. And that is that perhaps I can only say that because I'm a lawyer, but I don't think the law matters nearly as much as the underlying norms. And to kind of, to put this in perspective, when I think about, taking on a country or taking on an issue, I have to admit that I have never in my 22 years at Human Rights Watch begun by asking, has the country ratified a treaty? It just doesn't enter the calculation. And I can, I guess your schooling metaphor was interesting, and maybe, if it's due to an information deficit, it may be that they don't really understand how we work, or maybe, there are other factors going on. But when we consider sort of, what issues or what countries to take on, we're much more concerned with, are we going to be able to highlight a discrepancy between the government's conduct and some norm, some pretense that it feels obliged to follow. And the treaty can manifest that, but it's not, for me, the most salient factor in all of this. Now, I'll explain that a little bit. Let me just, first by way of caveat say that I do think that treaties have been important, if for no other reason that they have helped to legitimize the human rights venture as a whole. And if, we were still in the era where governments were able to say that, talking about human rights is interfering in their internal affairs, which, you still get glimmers of from now and then, but it's a totally discredited argument and it doesn't get, people anything. If I think it's treaties that have helped to undermine that argument. And so just, whether any particular government is ratified, the fact that so many governments have ratified so many human rights treaties shows that the discussion of how a government treats its people is a legitimate conversation at the international level. I mean, that's tremendously important. The other thing that I think is important, and this is a corollary of that, is that much of the way the human rights movement puts pressure on an abusive government is by getting influential third-party governments to put pressure on the target. And that pressure can come through, conditionality in terms of aid. It can come in the form of, the EU cooperation agreements where there's, kind of a standard clause in there requiring respect for human rights and democracy. It can come at the level of, whether it's appropriate to invite autocrat so-and-so to your next fancy summit. I mean, these kinds of pressure comes up in a lot of different ways, but it is now kind of an accepted part of what it means to be a sort of responsible international player, that governments have to at least pretend to treat human rights as one significant element of their foreign policy. They talk about it. It's a factor in their in their bilateral relations. And so, that also, I think, is to a degree a product of treaties. Now, I don't want to overstate that because, and I think this is one very good part of your book, you deliberately don't look at state-to-state compliance. And I think you rightly write that off as not where it's at. Because, I mean, if you look at sort of the formal state-to-state compliance mechanisms, they are hardly ever used. I mean, I think the best example of that, which is not technically a human rights treaty, but it's a humanitarian law treaty, the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, which today is sort of the principal treaty governing modern warfare, has in Article 90, you mentioned this in your book, a fact-finding commission that was established where whenever there is sort of a contested issue, states can ask for this fact-finding commission to go and investigate what happened. Were war crimes committed? And I forget when it was created, but it's been 20 years or something, and it's never been used. Or to take another example, the main U.S. strategy to try to prevent the International Criminal Court from having real bite was to try to insist that the only two ways that the court could be seized of a case was either through the Security Council, where the U.S. could control the process with its veto, or through a state complaint. And the U.S. knew that states don't complain to each other, or do so in rare instances. They fought tooth and nail to avoid the prosecutor on his own be able to bring a case. And that's because they realized that state-to-state compliance is not the key factor here. Now, I recognize that in places like the Human Rights Council, you do get states speaking out against other states, but it tends to be against adversaries. It's not a reliable mean of enforcement in a more routine situation. Now, in the book you talk about customary international law, and that's, I mean, I may have missed it because I have to, but my sense was that when you thought of norms, you mainly thought about custom in that sense, as really just kind of another dimension of the law, but one that's not codified. And for me, while customary international law has its role, I mean, for example, the U.S. has never ratified, the first additional protocol, but it complies with it because it considers most of it custom. So it's not irrelevant. But for me, the norms that matter much more are at the level of sort of what you might call public morality. Just, what do people think is right or wrong? And that population can be, ideally would be, within the target country. But at times there can be a surrogate public. So if you have a sort of a significant aid relationship and you can convince, another public to change that aid relationship or to condition it, you can move a target country even if public morality hasn't evolved sufficiently in the target country. But, when I think about sort of the different types of rights, I mean, I guess let me put it this way. I think it would be useful in your analysis to distinguish among different types of rights in terms of how firm the sort of the common public understood norm is. And so, at one extreme, I would put things like, torture or summary executions, where there is just, broad public recognition that these are wrong. And my hypothesis would be that in those situations, treaties matter the least. I also would guess that treaties matter less when the right as codified is subject to interpretation. And so if you take something like the right to freedom of speech or the right to freedom of assembly, these are so qualified in terms of various raison d'etat that the government can qualify them. Security concerns, public order, public health, what have you. That, again, it's often, the treaty gets you sort of only so far. And you end up having to debate, what is the meaning of this norm in a certain context. And there again, I think again, it's the public morality that probably matters much more, my guess would be, than the treaty itself. Where ratification, I would think, matters a lot is where the norm itself is very contested. And so, for me, I would look at things like women's rights, religious rights, sexual rights, rights where there really is not universal acceptance at the public level. So that if a government ratifies, that's a major statement. And it is sort of settling a cultural dispute in a way that there's really not a lot to settle when the issue is torture. So, I would, to qualify this further, I think that to use the sort of the three types of effects that you see treaties having or ratification having. One, setting the agenda. Two, creating legal mechanisms or legal opportunities. And three, opportunities for social mobilization. I would think that ratification matters most with respect to legal remedies. And that's almost by definition. That if you are going to appeal to a court, whether it's a domestic court or for that matter an international court, to have chapter and verse, to have actually, the treaty legally binding does matter. And so you would expect it to, matter, in the European Union or for that matter in Latin America, where the Inter-American Court is increasingly playing a significant role. Now, I recognize that these are also the governments that tend to be more democratic, so there may be other factors at play that reduce the significance of having that legally recognized right. But, I think that I do see your thesis having significance where the tool is legal. But in terms of agenda setting as well as social mobilization, what I would suggest, and it may be, I couldn't really, I'm just not well enough versed in the sort of the mathematical side of this to know what all this meant, but and you maybe have already sort of tested for this, but I would, when I looked through your list, I didn't see it there. And that is, is an alternative explanation that there is a strong public norm as opposed to that the government is ratified. And this maybe is kind of a cause and effect question. I mean, has the movement toward ratification, at least assuming some degree of sincerity, using your four-part scheme there, is that more a product of the emergence of norms? And does or to put it another way, does the significance with respect to behavior, does that come more from the existence of the norm or from the existence of the treaty? And I say this because, again, when you look at how at least let me begin with the international human rights movement, we almost by definition don't use litigation. If there's kind of an ACLU, a local version of the ACLU that can handle the matter, we stay away. I mean, groups like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International are basically non-litigation organizations. And so, we use shaming, we use, various forms of pressure from third-party governments. And, for those to work, my sense is that the existence of this norm matters much more than the existence of ratification. And while, there is an educative role to ratification, again, it's just thinking intuitively, my sense is that it matters much less than other factors in terms of building, a public disapproval of a particular governmental practice. Similarly with respect to mobilization, if you're mobilizing to, well, I guess even there's worth dividing mobilization into two types. I mean, on the one hand, if the mobilization is simply to put pressure on the government, to get a lot of people in the streets, I actually don't think either the norm or the the legal right matters that much. I mean, if you succeed in getting enough people on the street, you'll move the government to change its behavior. But if the aim is more of a shaming one, then my sense is that the existence of sort of some public sense that a government should operate a certain way matters more than whether that government has ratified a particular treaty or not. And I can't prove this, but this is just kind of intuitively, as I look at sort of, the factors that seem to go into both domestic rights and international rights organizations, we really are looking more at areas where a government is under some expectation of a certain behavior, quite apart from the seeming technicality of whether it's ratified or not. Let me just make one final point about where I think treaties matter the most. And this is not in the case of any of the 6 treaties that you were looking at. But where I think treaties are most important is where you already have a treaty, but it's ambiguous as to what's required. And so, to give an example, which is, I realize, maybe a notch away from what you were looking at, but if you take the concept of indiscriminate warfare, there is a treaty that prohibits indiscriminate warfare. That's what, the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions does. Nonetheless, that prohibition, which was broadly ratified and also accepted as customary international law, was able to coexist with the widespread use of anti-personnel landmines, which are an inherently indiscriminate weapon because they have no idea who's going to step on them. And it could be a soldier, but it could just be an ordinary civilian. Now, if you had gone to court and said, Judge, please outlaw landmines because they're indiscriminate, you would have pretty much gotten thrown out of court, because even though, a simple reading of the protocol would say, well, yes, indiscriminate, and these seem to be indiscriminate, there was a parallel treaty that was sort of regulating landmines rather than prohibiting them. And the judge would have said, well, there's a separate legal regime, so clearly the drafters of the protocol weren't thinking to outlaw landmines when they adopted this provision on indiscriminate warfare, so sorry, you lose. And so in that circumstance, what was required was a new treaty, a treaty that basically said that landmines are indiscriminate. The same thing happened with cluster munitions. It was very much the same process. Or to take another example, the child soldiers. If you had gone to court, 15 years ago, and said, I want to, sue my government for using 15-year-old kids, or 16-year-old kids, let's say, as soldiers, you would have lost, because the Geneva Conventions actually contemplated using people 16 to 18, or 16 and 17. And it took a new treaty, basically, redefining what a child was for military purposes, to raise the bar, and to kind of reinterpret the otherwise permissive standards of the Geneva Conventions. Now, what these 3 examples have in common, each of them we went through a very similar process. It began with fact-finding. We investigated a lot of situations where landmines were used, or child soldiers were used, or cluster munitions were used, and we built public outrage at this practice. And we showed the kind of the human toll of these practices. That led to a norm. People began to think it was wrong to use landmines. It was wrong to use child soldiers. That norm preceded any treaty. It was from that norm that we were slowly able to mobilize civil society and then ultimately governments to adopt a treaty. And that new treaty then kind of reinterpreted the broad provisions of the weaker, more general treaty that preexisted. Now the question is, where in that process did government behavior change? And my sense is that for the most part, government behavior, it began to switch with the creation of the norm. And it completely switched by the time we got a treaty, but before anybody had ratified. And so, at the moment that the treaty was adopted, landmine use had stopped. And then over the next few years, governments began to ratify. But that it was the norm process and then the kind of the formal process of having a treaty that mattered much more than the commitment of any given government. And indeed, a government like the United States, which is never committed to the Landmines Treaty, wouldn't dare use landmines today because the norm is so strong. And so this is just one example, but it's part of what makes me think that I'd be interested in sort of how your analysis played out, if there was a way to do this, to measure not simply the commitment, which is the focus, but rather the existence of kind of strong public expectations about governmental conduct. And while I would expect the treaty to matter much more in a society where litigation was possible, there are many, many countries in the world where the courts are weak and where it is really only public pressure or mobilization that is going to get things done. And in those circumstances, my hypothesis would be that the norm is more important than the treaty. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ken. I was so worried that you were going to agree with Beth about everything, and thank goodness you didn't. So, Alex Cooley.
Yeah.
Next up.
Thanks. I will be brief because I know there are a lot of questions in the audience. The book is great. You have a sense of that, I think, already from the presentation, just the scope of it, the empirics, the nuance is really fabulous in this book. And what I really appreciate a lot is sort of the eye Beth has for macro trends. And you don't pick this up so much in the presentation, but in the book, she singles out a number of episodes that seem to be innocuous or insignificant, and then really looks at some of the long-term downstream effects that these have for mobilization and so forth. So, for instance, 1974, 1976 U.S. congressional decision to tie foreign aid to rights seemed like a very limited type of move, but had all these consequences in terms of creating a demand for information gathering to see if you're in compliance with these provisions. So the book is excellent for a number of different reasons, but I think the text itself is very nuanced. It's not just about sort of regression equations and running the numbers and sort of the kind of rigorous empirical work Beth does. She really looks at the evolution of the sovereignty regime in international law, the evolution of mechanisms of accountability and verification, as well as providing theories of ratification, non-ratification, compliance, and non-compliance. And there's, I think, a modesty to the book that's very, very welcome. The thing I like most about the book, theoretically, is that it's very political. Now, this seems strange coming from political science, but one of the reasons that people like me are particularly skeptical of a lot of the stuff that comes out is you hear arguments like norms produce so-and-so, or states coerce so-and-so, right? This argument's a lot more sophisticated about that and involves the stuff of domestic political contestation, right? Treaties change politics. It's a very central contention in Beth's book. That is, once you pass a treaty, politics can't be the same, right? Everything else is not equal. So the interaction of domestic politics, domestic institutional structures, gives us some insights into sort of these false negatives and false positives. By the way, the false negatives discussion I found fascinating, because I think about false positives a lot. I examine Eurasia. And I had always assumed, well, why doesn't the United States sign these things? Well, of course, it's hegemonic power. It's the George Bush administration. But actually, I was pretty convinced that, common law and federalism really are part of the story. And your observation that this applies to children, treaties on women and children, I think lends credence to that. This is not just a national security issue, even though we sort of tried to defend it that way. And the Australian example, I think, is also convincing within those terms. So that part of it I really like. So the question then gets to sort of false positives, right? Why do governments sign on to things that are obviously not in their interest, or obviously going to come back to haunt them? And Beth, I think, gives very plausible mechanisms: short time horizons, the need for sort of short-term benefits like strategic acceptance, and so forth. I think the real theoretical contribution of the book is separating out differential consequences of this across different polities. And this sort of category of transitional, anacratic, whatever term you want to use, countries is key, and it's key because of the institutional instability that we see in them. And Beth, there's a line in the conclusion where you sort of nicely summarize this, but I think you could even sort of emphasize this more, that the common feature that we see in these polities is that institutions are up for grabs. They're in flux, whether it be the relationship of the courts to the system, whether it's the independence of parliament vis-a-vis the executive, process of decentralization. You don't mention it, but I would include that in the list too, sort of empowering sort of local governments and the way local communities do daisy chains around central governments and invoke sort of international law and treaties and so forth. This is what happened to polities in flux. And so a lot of the mechanisms Beth is talking about is actors for their own political purposes, not just because they're normatively committed. And I don't want to take that out of the equation, and I think Ken is right to point that out. But a lot of actors for their own political purposes mobilize around this. And I think that's what I find deeply satisfying about this type of explanation. My big set of questions or comments really strikes at the heart of this regionalism issue. I think this is key. And Beth describes this. Could we be seeing a kind of a rational school of fish kind of phenomenon here for the false positives? You sort of comply, everyone else complies, and you sort of hide in the background, and you don't want to be singled out. And here I think there's a little bit of room for pushback on behalf of sort of social constructivists. That is, what you test seems to be strategic ratification versus socialization, but socialization in the very deep sense of the word, right? The internalization of a norm, right? The adoption of this. And there's also a kind of 1 degree removed school of social thought, talked about sort of social influence, right? And under social influence models, rules, standards, and behaviors are not internalized or believed, but they're adopted to conform with the pack for prestige reasons, for status reasons, right? I think it's very plausible that if states think of themselves as part of a group, and that's certainly true of Eastern Europe, it's certainly true of the Baltics, certainly true of Central Asia, regional leaders also think of themselves as group members, and they think about who has the status in the group and who doesn't. I don't want to belabor the analogy because it's a very kind of political sciencey issue, but I guess I'm not convinced that social camouflage really is a rationalist mechanism. I tend to see it more in the kind of social influence category, and I guess what would be the single distinguishing feature that has. So why does this matter? I think the fact that the Central Asian countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and this is there on a chart that Beth has signed all 6 core treaties without entering reservations or declarations is really good evidence that they're going through the motions, right? That it's exactly because they don't have reservations, right, that they seem to be engaging in this form of mimicry, right? Yeah, whatever, we'll do it. We don't want to stand out. We don't want to draw attention to us and so forth. And thinking about the post-communist world, we also start thinking about the different influences and the variable influences then that these social groups have. And I think there's at least two distinct social groups. One is Eastern Europe and the Baltics. Their social pull and their European pull was overdetermined, right? Yes, treaty compliance, they were democracies, but they were facing a lot of conditions from the EU, a lot of conditions from NATO, from the transatlantic community. I think this works in tandem with your argument. And I think actors actually, in terms of invoking EU conditionality, did so very strategically to sort of throw out autocrats or uncommitted democrats and so forth. Central Asia and the Caucasus seems to have a different regional pull, right? Initially, there was this kind of school of fish dynamic, but now we're seeing a pull in the opposite direction. And the backlash against human rights, the backlash against the OECD, its Office for Democratic Initiatives and sort of human rights commitments. Some people have argued that this is at the behest of Russia. This is an example of sort of sovereign democracy, that this has intensified as competing models, such as China, have risen. Again, that's a school of fish kind of dynamic, or is that kind of a sort of following a kind of a status and prestige influence, right? Whether it be sort of Moscow or Beijing as a justification for what they're doing or not doing. So the regional dimension of this is critical, and I think in the post-communist world you see very different regional influences, and that's going to determine their long-term commitments to these things. Finally, just very briefly, a question for Beth and a question for Ken. And Ken, I'm not supposed to be your discussant. Since you're captive here, you're going to get the question anyway. The question for Beth is, how can we tell, what are the one or two indicators that you would sort of point to and say, aha, a country has moved from being don't even bother about it to the influenceable category? Is it that they have outgrowth of sort of civil society, that there's a regime collapse, that there's a degree of freedom of the press? I mean, what one or two features would you say are the most important to thinking that these sort of strategies by activists or court strategies could be sort of influential? Should we look for? And Ken, what are the implications of Beth's findings regarding the hard authoritarian cases in Human Rights Watch's strategies? Does it make sense to conduct certain advocacy activities about compliance, empower local NGOs and information gatherers when they face such daunting obstacles, when they might be tried, imprisoned, all the things that, of course, you're all too aware of? Is the implication here, a provocative one, that Human Rights Watch and groups like it should instead wait for real tactical opportunities that are presented by either domestic developments or regional developments, right? Revolution in Kyrgyzstan opens the door again to talking about Uzbekistan in a way that hasn't been possible for 4 or 5 years and so forth. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So what I'm proposing to do now is to have Beth respond to any one or 2 points that the discussants have raised, then to ask Ken to respond to Alex's question, and while they're doing that, people in the audience, please line up at the mic because you'll get your turn for your question in just a minute. So, Beth.
Alrighty, okay. I think from Ken, I think it's important really to respond to this question. The primary question, it really was laced throughout most of your presentation, Ken, was this idea of, are they really responding to the broader norms or to the ratification per se? And I want to re-emphasize the reasons why, from the point of view of a domestic person on the ground, the ratification is really important, okay? And let me admit that from the point of view of Amnesty International, it's not so important, okay? But look at what are the advantages that ratification does for you if you are a local living in a country. It pre-commits the government, okay? And by pre-committing the government, that is with a public vote. Well, in many countries, a public vote. In some cases, not a public vote, actually, but some other kind of public form of commitment. It actually gives you ammunition that this is legitimate locally. This is really an important point because it is very easy, for precisely the reasons that Alex outlines, for groups within a country or for a government to push back against the West, right? To push back against Amnesty International, to push back against Western norms, and to find very attractive alternative, maybe Eastern norms or other forms of norms. But to ratify is to indigenize to a certain extent, okay? To indigenize by saying, we agree this is legitimate. And so I think that's an advantage that you have by ratification if you are on the ground. Now, that wouldn't make any difference to Amnesty International. But if you are living in the country and trying to think of a strategy for making demands, that's a huge factor to have in your favor. It also, in sort of contra the idea of norms matter, it helps to spell things out and put them in very clear focus. I can think of specific rights that it would be very hard to sort of coalesce around had it not been in a treaty. And one of the things I can think of, for example, is that we didn't even talk about women's rights, for example, in here. But an entire chapter I have deals on that. And a woman's right to reproductive health, for example. Not sort of just a norm floating around out there, sort of free form, but something very concrete in a treaty that women, for example, women in Colombia pointed to and lobbied for specifically during a constitutional convention and said, we want this language about a right to reproductive health care in our Constitution, and it was made and put into their Constitution. And that, again, creates a platform for a legitimate demand and not just a vague Western demand of some kind, and again, poses the possibility of litigation. So I'm going to speculate that ratification matters more to the locals than it does to Amnesty International. Amnesty International has some other tools. They can leverage third parties to a certain extent, although I want to put a little footnote on that because third parties don't care anywhere near as much as the people on the ground. Third parties can be very fickle based on their foreign policy objectives, based on their funding priorities, based on all kinds of things that would cause them, would cause them to back off from rights when it's not convenient, not, sort of cost effective from their point of view, or when the sort of light of publicity sort of goes in a new crisis over here instead of over there. Well, it's locals on the ground over here that constantly care about it, and that's why to them it's very important to indigenize these rights, and that's what ratification helps to do. On Alex, I like his argument about backlash in Central Asia, and I think that's very true, and that's again why ratification is quite important, is that it kind of kicks that excuse out from under a government for not complying. That it was imposed on us by the West. No, you ratified, you accepted as legitimate, so we're going to hold you to that. So I think that's a very good and helpful point. On Alex's question, when is a country convincible? No one indicator is possible. Anything I say is going to be inadequate. But I would say that when they start to tolerate and acknowledge the legitimacy of opposition is when that door starts to crack open just a little bit.
Right. Well, just quickly, I mean, in terms of, Beth, the argument is sort of spelling out rights. I agree that it's important that a right is spelled out in a treaty. But that's true whether or not there's ratification. And so if you want to know, what are women's rights, you can look to CEDAW. But, in terms of defining the right, the ratification isn't critical. Now, where I do think, ratification matters, as I said, I think on something like women's rights where they were much more contested, to have a government commit to then abide by them can have, real behavioral consequences. I think that matters much less in the realm of torture, where, whether or not they're ratified, no government's going to sort of claim the right to torture. And so I think that, I think it really, you almost have to look at the kind of right that we're talking about in terms of assessing the significance of the ratification itself. Alex, in terms of your question, when, what do you do with the hard authoritarian governments? I do think that local pressure ultimately is determinative. And so, if you don't have civil society, you try to do two things. I mean, one is you gradually try to create space so a local civil society can emerge. But second, you pay much more attention to third-party pressure. And indeed, one of the major focuses of that pressure usually is one of two things. It's either, aimed at creating that civil society space, or it's aimed at curtailing the worst kinds of atrocities. And so, for example, if you take your Central Asia, Caucasus example, I actually don't think what they're objecting to are the so-called Western norms. At this point, they want to be a member of the OSCE, they just don't want the OSCE enforcement mechanisms. And so they're not challenging the standards right now, they're challenging things like deploying police monitors or deploying investigative teams. And that's enforcement, that's not the norm itself.
Thank you.
So we're close to our advertised ending time, but we will take a couple of questions if you have them, and please stand at the mic if you can.
Well, thank you for the presentation. I haven't read the book. I was intrigued by the false positive section. So if I understand you well, there are different situations. I mean, those who are ratify because they are misinformed, or because they are simply stupid, to put it bluntly, or who have incentives of different sort, or pressure, status as an incentive. Now, how do you address situations of good weather? I mean, for a certain period of time, there's no problem to ratify, say, the Genocide Convention in Rwanda before '94. And how do you address the situation of double standards by powerful players? I mean, if I know that the US doesn't care about torture, well, as Pinochet, I will ratify cynically. So it's nothing of those situations you describe. And yeah, what is the impact of double standards on your scheme?
The world is rife with double standards. They are everywhere. They are in particular among the false negatives, and especially among the false positives.
Talking about the false positive. I mean,
So your question is, what do we do about double standards, right?
well,
Or what do?
now, what is the impact of double standards on false positives, and then the consequence on mobilizing the local people or not?
I'm sorry. Are you asking the double standards like in the United States with respect to human rights?
Yeah, a strong player has a double standard, and then you have a country where the government ratifies because it knows that there is a double standard, so it doesn't care. It is cynical, and then the consequence of mobilizing local people, because those local people, they are of course sufficiently sophisticated to understand what ratification means in this particular context. I mean, I wouldn't stand up under the Pinochet regime as it was during the time of ratification of the treaty you mentioned.
Well, a lot of people did actually, though.
Well,
which is the interesting thing.
The consequences.
But the effect of double standards is to create a sort of expectation that nothing will be done. And so it actually allows for the potential of more false positives. And this is precisely what we saw in the earlier years of many of these treaties, so like in the 70s and 1980s, when we were a period in which the Cold War, for example, convinced a lot of countries that we're buddies with the United States, we can ratify, they're not going to do anything to us, despite the fact that they demand, sort of human rights standards, and that the United States is not going to come down on us. They need us strategically and everything else. We're their allies. And I think that is a kind of condition that has led to a period in which a number of countries ratified just for the short-term gains involved. And it turns out that this, it doesn't stand for long, because the international rights community ends up exposing the fact that there's a double standard there. But it does open up this expectation that maybe I can get away with it.
Well, the last point I was intrigued was customary law, actually. Customary law, the effect of customary law. I mean, let's take the Rome Statute, for example. I mean, most of the contents of the Rome Statute are customary law. So if I ratify as a government an authoritarian, it's a kind of fatalism also, because I have anyway no choice. Whether I ratify or not, the law will apply one day if I'm thinking rationally.
The Rome Statute's a sort of a different case, because it doesn't require mobilization domestically or anything else to really have some kind of an enforcement power. So what I'm talking about are treaties in which the most likely mechanism for their enforcement is likely to be on the ground in the domestic context, enforcement at the domestic level. The Rome Statute's quite the opposite. Enforcement is precisely external in that case, except if you take into account, of course, the complementarity provisions of the Rome Statutes.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's collect both of the last questions and respond to them together. So please.
Thank you for a stimulating discussion. I wanted to ask you about perhaps a more enigmatic example, that the case of Russia, which I have some personal experience with. And it's not a treaty that you covered, but the example of the European Convention on Human Rights. I think that we could make the case that when Russia ratified this treaty, it was a sincere ratifier, but that may have changed. At the same time, there is sort of a very dedicated community in Russia that's highly mobilized behind the rights that this convention embodies, but it's a very small but highly mobilized community within the country. And so my question is, we're in a different position now, and the sincerity of Russia with respect to these obligations is much more in question. And so I was wondering if you had sort of any understanding within your model of how to understand which way the cookie will crumble. What are the important things to look at in figuring out what might happen? What are the important things that the leaders of these countries are looking into? Thank you.
Okay, so let's take the next two questions as well.
Hi, thank you for speaking tonight. I have a question regarding local legislation in terms of city ballots, because I was wondering if any of your, in any of your research or data analyses, if you use city legislation to compare country data, such as the Seattle Right to Healthcare ballot initiative, or the CDOT passed in San Francisco, or a local minimum wage hire for domestic workers here in New York. What kind of impact does that have on federal legislation, or any impact as far as a visual impact around the world? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very impressed by Mr. Roth's question raising the public opinions, because the controversy between Professor Simmons and Mr. Roth seems to be a methodological one. I mean, Mr. Roth raised the moral issue, but that is not observable, but it will raise a question whether how political science can deal with moral issue which is not observable, or it is quite difficult to say qualified. So my question is, my question to Mr. Roth is, how can you prove the public opinion is more important than treaty? And my question to Professor Simmons is, how moral issue can be fit into your theory? Thank you.
Okay, well, let's just, I guess, start with the question of Russia. And, here the issue is sort of thinking about Russia, involved in, various kinds of political and regime change that would make it a sort of no longer interested in being held to its ratification obligations. That maybe at one point it was a sincere ratifier, and now it no longer is. And, that many of these regimes are still in flux. When I sort of say who the sincere ratifiers are and sincere non-ratifiers, that's at the time of ratification, basically. There is nothing in these treaties that's going to prevent underlying political change. If we think that's going to happen, it's not. It's the kind of thing in which these treaties could, at a minimum, I think, and maybe even at a maximum, prove useful to make a case or a claim that despite important, regime changes and political changes, that nonetheless, it's important to try to live up to these obligations. And I would expect completely that as a sort of other indicators of democracy and rule of law begin to disintegrate, that the obligation to live up to a treaty obligation would as well. So all of the models that I look at, like control for the level of democracy, for example, and control for things like civil war, which is not the Russian situation at all, but control for other kinds of facts, conditions that we know affect human rights. Because I don't think we can expect magic out of these treaties. The European Convention is not going to prove magic in Russia any more than these treaties do in any other circumstance. What I'm trying to argue is that they prove useful for those who want to try to press their rights. And I would imagine that in the Russian case, that locals would make as much use as they possibly could make out of the European Convention. And at the margins, it'll help, but it won't reverse, sort of broadly deteriorating trends in Russia. That is to imagine way too much in terms of the power of treaties. I don't have an answer to local legislation in cities. Of course, I don't have any data on this. One can imagine a completely different kind of a research project in which the unit of analysis was the city instead of the country, and to look to see whether some of these ordinances about discrimination and minimum wage have some kind of local impact. That would be a different kind of a research focus, but you could imagine using some of the same kinds of sort of theoretical accounts that I've used at the national level. So you'd expect those who want a minimum wage to wave around the resolution of the city council, for example, or the ordinance. You would expect them to point to that and say, this is what our city stands for. This is what you said you're going to do. And in any event, when they actually find behaviors that are against their own past statutes, that it would be very useful to have a very explicit commitment on the part of the city, but I don't have an answer, because that's not something I've actually looked at. But one can imagine a parallel study or a similar study that looked at the domestic level. Public opinion, hard to codify. So the issue here is, sort of how do we handle this sort of issue that, maybe the public just is sort of all behind it and the treaty doesn't tip anything. It's a little hard to explain my results if that's the case, because the treatment that every country's getting to look for the change in practices is the ratification. So it sort of flies in the face of the empirical results to sort of use the before and after treaty ratification if we think that it's something much broader like public opinion. And I have no doubt that public opinion plays some kind of role. The point is, it's not swamping the treaty effect. It's very well in place, but it very well may be in place. But the treaty effect is something that is distinguishable from what may very well be going on in the background. We could say the same thing about sort of broader international norms. The Universal Declaration's in the background the whole time, right? But it's actually the ratification of these treaties which is producing the result that I'm pointing to. And again, I think it really has to do with the indigenization, the focal point, and the sense that what you're asking is legitimate, because your own government has told you it's legitimate.
And now there's one last shot.
Sure. Well, let me just answer the one question that was just directed to me. I mean, it obviously is difficult to measure, public opinion or public norms. And I know that, political science these days is clearly skewed toward the measurable, toward the quantitative. And, other approaches are sort of dismissed as just anecdotal. I think what I would urge, and there must be people who do this, but I just, I'm not immersed enough in the field to know, I would urge sort of a more systematic anecdotal approach. That is to say, I think the way to kind of get at these issues is to look at a series of country situations and talk to people who have been through the evolution and ask them what their analysis of why things changed. And to see if you can evolve a pattern through kind of a serious, sort of systematic look at different anecdotes. I mean, and just to pick one example that Beth cited here, I'm not convinced by the Israel statistics there, because I followed that situation, and I don't think the CAT ratification had much to do with anything, because there was already a legal prohibition of torture. Israel had already ratified the Geneva Conventions long ago, which outlawed torture. I don't know when the ICCPR was ratified in this mix, but it also outlawed torture. CAT was sort of one more commitment by the Israeli government not to torture, but it was redundant. And even when there was a prior legal commitment, the Landau Commission had come out and said moderate physical pressure is okay. And what was the difference between the Landau Commission and the 1999 Israeli High Court opinion that said, no, you can't use this moderate physical pressure, it's getting out of hand? The difference was a bunch of fact-finding showing that, what was supposed to be rare, occasional use of moderate physical pressure in a circumstance of a ticking time bomb actually was being used all the time, because the security forces thought that every Palestinian was a ticking time bomb. And if, he may not know where the bomb was going off that moment, but, his friend might have a cousin who would know where the bomb is going off, 2 months from now. And why are those victims any less deserving of protection from torture than the people who might be killed, with the bomb going off right now? And so it got completely out of hand. 90% of the Palestinian security suspects were being tortured. And it got to the point where finally the court had to step in. I think that was much more important than the ratification of CAT. And I don't think you get at that with the statistics. You got to get at that by sort of doing an anecdotal analysis. Talk to people who were there, who understood how the pressure built toward that court decision. And you know, I'm aware of the difficulty of doing that in any single case. But if there was a way to do that more systematically, I'd be interested in that.
Am I allowed anything
Yes,
else?
sir, rebuttal from Professor Simmons.
I just want to say there is one aspect of the Israeli story that neither one of us had mentioned that is clearly related to the CAT. And that is that once the CAT was ratified, it was incumbent on the Israeli government to report to the Committee Against Torture. The Committee Against Torture clearly said now, oh, by the way, those practices you're engaging in, those are torture, even though you've been saying you don't do torture. That was very, very useful information for these court cases. That information would not have been available had Israel not ratified the Convention Against Torture and gotten into this dialogue back and forth with the Committee Against Torture. And it becomes politically relevant to have that information in your hand when you're talking about that building of that litigation over time. I just want to say one more thing about the public opinion. There actually is a way, I deleted the slide because I just didn't have time for it, but I have done a little, I did a survey on public opinion in which I gave everybody a paragraph that said, basically it said the U.S. is engaging in practices that some people believe constitute torture. Should we stop if there's some danger to the national interest of the United States? I gave the same statement, background information, to two groups, altered only one bit of information between the two, and that was the claim that the United States has ratified the Convention Against Torture, which prohibits those practices. So it was a random treatment on public opinion. And the answers as to whether or not the United States should stop those practices are not shifted 15% in favor of the law treatment the way that you would expect it. So I infer from that there are good reasons to believe that people expect states to live up to their international legal obligations, and that potentially there might even be audience costs, domestic audience costs for governments that don't do so. Point being, we can get through this through surveys. And if these surveys include a test treatment or a law treatment suggesting there's an obligation and a breach of an obligation, we can actually unpack precisely the difference between public opinion and treaty ratification.
So, Alex, quick plug for our event on
Yes.
November 11th.
Yes, excellent. On November 11th in the series, we will talk about the politics of corruption rankings and indices of Mlada Bukovansky from Smith College. We'll have Nate Heller, who's the head of global integrity, and Harriman Institute Director Tim Fry. So mark that in your calendars, November 11th. Yep.
So, thanks to Beth, Ken, and Alex for a lively panel.
Thank you for your comments.